Chapter 1. The Turning Tide. The year began not with a bang, but with a groan. It was January 1863, and America stood knee-deep in blood and mud, divided not just by geography, but by fear, fire, and exhaustion. The Civil War had dragged into its third winter, and there was no end in sight. More than 200,000 men had already fallen, dead, wounded, or missing. And yet the appetite for war remained, fed by hatred, by righteousness, and by desperation on both sides. In the North, optimism had dimmed. The great hopes of early victories had been smothered under the weight of disasters. Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, second Bull Run again. The latest blow had come in December at Fredericksburg, where Union General Ambrose Burnside hurled wave after wave of brave young men into a wall of Confederate gunfire. They died in rows, their blue coats piling up in front of a stone wall they could not breach. It was a slaughter. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln wore the grief like a second skin. He had placed his hope in generals, and those generals had failed him time and again. But even before that, back in the fall of 1862, there had been a flicker of something that looked like a shift in the wind. The Battle of Antietam, fought in the cornfields of Maryland in September, had been the single bloodiest day in American history. Nearly 23,000 casualties. But it had stopped Robert E. Lee's advance into the North, and Lincoln had seized the moment. Just days after the guns fell silent, he issued a warning. If the South did not lay down its arms by the end of the year, he would free the slaves in all rebellious states. It was not just a threat. It was a promise. And that promise would reshape the war. As the new year dawned, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln sat in the White House, his hand trembling slightly, not from hesitation, but from fatigue. He had spent the morning shaking hands at the annual New Year's reception, and by the time he took up the pen, his right arm was almost numb. But he steadied himself, dipped the pen in ink, and scrawled his name, Abraham Lincoln. The words that followed would change everything. From that moment forward, the war was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was about ending slavery. The South called it an outrage. The North called it a clarion call. The world watched with sharpened eyes. Britain and France, who had teetered on the edge of recognizing the Confederacy, now found themselves pulled back. Supporting the South would mean supporting slavery. And few dared make that leap. Still, paper proclamations could not win wars. As the snow melted and the roads turned to mud, the real fight continued. In the camps of the Union Army, the soldiers read of the proclamation in worn newspapers and posted broadsides. Some cheered, some muttered. Many were indifferent. They hadn't signed up to free anybody. They'd signed up to go home with honor, maybe a paycheck, and most of all, alive. But in black communities across the North, the news was met with tears and prayers. Slaves in the South heard rumors whispered like wind through the cotton fields. The proclamation didn't free them directly, not yet. But it was a sign, a crack in the wall, a promise in waiting. And then came the next blow. In early May, near a crossroads town in Virginia called Chancellorsville, the Union Army suffered one of its most humiliating defeats. General Joseph Hooker, nicknamed Fighting Joe, though the title was more bravado than the fact, had a massive numerical advantage. Nearly 130,000 Union troops faced just 60,000 Confederates. But Lee, bold as ever, split his forces, sending General Thomas Stonewall Jackson on a wide flanking maneuver through thick woods. It was audacious. It was dangerous. And it worked. The Union Army, caught by surprise, fell into disarray. Hooker himself was knocked unconscious for a time when an artillery shell hit a pillar he was leaning against. Leadership faltered. Confederate troops pushed hard. The Union lines broke, then broke again. When the smoke cleared, the North had lost 17,000 men, the Confederacy 13,000. But the South claimed victory, and rightly so. And yet, that victory came at a terrible price. On the night of May 2nd, as Jackson rode back through the woods to rally his men, he was mistaken for a Union cavalryman. Confederate pickets opened fire. Jackson was hit 3 times, twice in the left arm, once in the right hand. His left arm was amputated. A week later, he died of pneumonia. Lee, upon hearing the news, famously said, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." It was a bitter omen. The South had won a battle, but it had lost its boldest general. In the North, the shock of Chancellorsville sent tremors through the capital. The newspapers were scathing. "Another useless sacrifice," some wrote. Lincoln walked the halls of the White House in silence. He had lost confidence in Hooker. He had lost confidence in nearly all his generals. Only one man seemed to be making progress. Ulysses S. Grant, out west, grinding the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg into starvation. But in the east, where the eyes of the nation always turned, the Union was still floundering. And so the stage was set. It was late spring now. The roads were dry, the rivers low, the fields green with new growth. And Robert E. Lee saw an opportunity. He had beaten the Union time and again in Virginia. But Virginia was weary. Its farms had been trampled, its homes emptied, its people sick with war. If he could take the fight north again, into Pennsylvania perhaps, or even further, he might relieve the pressure on his homeland. He might feed his troops off enemy land. He might win a battle so decisive, so stunning, that it would shatter Northern morale and force Lincoln to the table. So Lee began to move. His army, the Army of Northern Virginia, slipped away from its entrenched positions, marched up the Shenandoah Valley, and crossed into Maryland. The people of the North panicked. In Harrisburg, in Philadelphia, church bells rang and train stations overflowed with women and children fleeing southward. Rumors swirled. Was Lee aiming for Washington, for Baltimore, for New York? In Washington, Lincoln watched anxiously. He had removed Hooker and replaced him with a new man, George Gordon Meade, a cautious, quiet officer who'd had the job for just 3 days. It was an unenviable position. Meade now commanded the Army of the Potomac, and he would have to stop Lee's advance somewhere, somehow. The two armies groped toward each other like blind giants. Their scouts clashed in scattered towns, roads flooded with columns of blue and gray. And then, almost by accident, they met in a little town in southern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. No one had planned it this way. Lee's troops had gone into the town searching for shoes. Meade's cavalry had moved in from the south. By July 1st, 1863, both armies were fully engaged, locked in a ferocious battle neither side had expected. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, the nation stood on a knife's edge. In just 6 months, 1863 had become a crucible. It had seen the proclamation that redefined the war. It had seen triumph and disaster, courage and foolishness, vision and blindness. It had seen a victory so brilliant, it came wrapped in mourning. It had seen a new general take command, just as the fate of the Republic hung in the balance. And as July approached, it would see something else. A battle so vast, so brutal, and so decisive that it would echo down through the generations. The tide had begun to turn, but whether it would break on the rocks of rebellion or wash the nation clean was still unknown. Chapter 2. The Emancipation Proclamation. The morning was gray. A thin fog clung to the streets of Washington, and the wind carried with it the iron scent of winter. January 1st, 1863 had arrived quietly. But what would happen that day would echo louder than any cannon. Inside the White House, Abraham Lincoln stood in his office, weary from the weight of the hour. He had been up since dawn, his long frame stiff from the days of ceremony and strain. Outside, the capital city moved slowly, soldiers stomping their boots for warmth, newspaper boys shouting headlines no one yet believed. But inside that room, history trembled on the edge of ink and parchment. The Emancipation Proclamation lay on the desk before him. He had waited months for this. On September 22nd, after the narrow, bloody Union victory at Antietam, Lincoln had issued his preliminary warning. The Confederate States had until the end of the year to return to the Union or face the consequences. They had not returned. They had not even considered it. And now, Lincoln would fulfill his promise. But as he took up the pen, his right hand quivered. Not from nerves, not from second thoughts, but from fatigue. Hours of handshaking at the traditional New Year's reception had left his arms so numb he could hardly hold the pen. He paused, looked at his secretary, and smiled faintly. "If my name ever goes into history," Lincoln said, "it'll be for this act. And my whole soul is in it." Then he signed. The Emancipation Proclamation declared that all slaves in the Confederate States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It was not a law passed by Congress. It was a wartime executive order, justified by Lincoln as a military necessity. It did not free the slaves in the border states still loyal to the Union, nor did it apply to Confederate territories already under Union control. But for millions still in bondage across the South, it meant hope. It meant change. It meant the war had become something greater. The reaction was immediate and divided. In the South, the proclamation was met with fury. Confederate leaders mocked it as meaningless, a piece of paper with no authority in their land. But beneath the bluster, they knew what it meant. It was a call to rebellion, not just of states, but of people. Slaves heard whispers of it, passed between cabins in hushed voices. The Union Army would now march with a different banner. Not just the stars and stripes, but the promise of liberation. In the North, the response was more complex. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass hailed it as a sacred step forward. "We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree," he wrote. But others were less enthusiastic. Many Union soldiers had enlisted to preserve the Union, not to fight for emancipation. Some openly resented the shift in purpose. And in places like New York and Ohio, angry mobs began to murmur about Lincoln's overreach. But Lincoln had made his choice. The war would now be about more than territory. It would be about morality. The political risks were enormous. The Democratic Party howled in protest, branding Lincoln a tyrant and warning of racial equality. Copperhead newspapers spread fear that freed slaves would flood the North, taking jobs and upending the social order. In the upcoming midterm elections, Republicans would suffer bruising losses in many states. But Lincoln believed the risk was worth it. Because the war, as it had been, was not enough. Blood had been spilled, and still the Union faltered. He needed something larger, something righteous, to justify the cost. And righteousness had its own power. The proclamation also changed the game diplomatically. England and France, both deeply tied to the cotton economy of the South, had flirted with recognizing the Confederacy. But public opinion in Europe was staunchly anti-slavery. With the proclamation, Lincoln dared the world to pick a side. To support the Confederacy now was to support human bondage. The British Parliament recoiled. The French hesitated. And the South began to realize it might fight this war alone. But the most profound change of all came not in Europe or Washington, but in the hearts of Black Americans. In the North, free Black men surged to recruitment offices, finally given the chance to fight for their freedom and their people. It had been illegal before, but now, with the stroke of Lincoln's pen, the doors opened. The United States colored troops would soon number nearly 180,000. Men who had once been forbidden to wear the uniform now marched with rifles, bayonets, and purpose. Some came from Massachusetts, like the famed 54th Regiment, the first officially recognized Black unit in the Union Army. Led by white officers but filled with men whose courage would inspire generations, they would go on to prove that bravery knew no color. Others came from the slave states themselves, runaways who had fled plantations, hidden in swamps, or followed Union armies as they marched through Dixie. These were men with scars on their backs, with rage in their eyes, and with nothing to lose. They joined the fight not just to end slavery, but to avenge it. And the fight was changing too. With the proclamation came a new Union strategy: total war. Slavery had not only been a moral stain, it had been the South's backbone. Enslaved people built the railroads, harvested the crops, cooked the food, and dug the trenches. By declaring them free, Lincoln aimed to cripple the Confederacy from within. Union armies were now instructed to protect and receive runaway slaves. Each plantation they passed became a potential recruiting ground. And still, the war dragged on. There were no great battles in January, no thunderous clashes to match the political shift. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Confederate leaders knew it. Union generals, some reluctantly, accepted it. Soldiers grumbled in the snow, but the orders came just the same. This was now a war for liberty. Back in Washington, Lincoln's inner circle was divided. Secretary of State William Seward had once cautioned against the proclamation, fearing foreign backlash. Now he supported it fully. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton threw himself into organizing the recruitment of Black regiments. The war machine groaned and turned, and Lincoln himself, tired, somber, and more isolated than ever, felt the weight of what he had done. He had not freed the slaves with a magic wand. Freedom, he knew, would have to be won inch by inch with blood. But he had turned the moral compass of the nation. He had drawn a line that no president before him had dared cross. Outside the White House, abolitionists gathered to celebrate. Black churches held vigils. Bells rang out in Boston, in Philadelphia, in small towns and cities across the North. In South Carolina, at Port Royal, newly freed people gathered in the night, listening as Union soldiers read the proclamation aloud. Some wept, some shouted, some fell to their knees. They could not yet grasp what it meant. But they knew the world had shifted. In the South, Confederate generals prepared for a new kind of war. They issued brutal orders. Any black man captured in a Union uniform would not be treated as a prisoner of war, but as a slave in rebellion. The risks for black soldiers were horrific. And still they volunteered. Lincoln's enemies pounced. Democrats accused him of destroying the Constitution. Newspapers ran cartoons of the president as a tyrant king. Pamphlets warned of race war. And the murmurs of unrest would soon boil into violence. In July, New York City would explode into 5 days of race riots, spurred by the draft and by the fear of freedmen. But that chaos had not yet come. In January, there was still the calm before the fire. Still, Lincoln pressed forward. He began working with Congress to push for the enlistment of black troops. He met with generals. He corresponded with European diplomats. But most of all, he waited. Waited to see whether the proclamation would truly change the war, or whether it would be buried beneath the next pile of casualties. The battlefield would decide. And the battlefield was drawing near. In the West, General Grant had begun closing the noose around Vicksburg, a Confederate fortress on the Mississippi. To the east, Lee's army was again on the move. The Union Army, now under the command of General Meade, was shifting northward. And somewhere between the farms and towns of Pennsylvania, a storm was gathering. But the meaning of the war had already changed. No longer was it simply a rebellion to be crushed. No longer was it just a constitutional crisis or a test of federal power. It had become a crusade. Not perfect, not clean, not without contradiction, but a crusade nonetheless. The war would now decide not just whether the Union would survive, but what kind of Union it would be. Free or slave, one or two nations, a republic of compromise or a republic of principle. And as Lincoln looked out the frosted window of the White House, he knew the cost would be terrible. He had taken a step that no American president had ever taken. He had turned the war into a revolution. Now it remained to be seen whether the country would follow him into the fire, or whether it would turn to ashes before it ever reached the promised land. Chapter 3. Mud, Defeat, and Despair. The ink had barely dried on the Emancipation Proclamation when the drums of war resumed their relentless beat. Winter still gripped the land, but war knew no season. And for the Union Army, the new year offered no immediate redemption, only the thick, clinging mud of defeat. Even before the proclamation, the North had suffered a blow that echoed all the way to the heart of Washington. In December 1862, just weeks before Lincoln's historic decree, the Union Army had launched a bold and disastrous assault on the Confederate stronghold of Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was meant to be a swift strike, a show of strength to end the year. Instead, it became a symbol of everything that was broken. General Ambrose Burnside, known for his impressive sideburns and less impressive tactics, had taken command of the Army of the Potomac with Lincoln's reluctant blessing. He was a decent man, loyal and brave, but he was not a battlefield genius. Still, he had a plan. Cross the Rappahannock River, storm the town of Fredericksburg, and break through to Richmond. It looks bold on paper, but paper doesn't bleed. Delays plagued the operation from the start. Pontoon bridges arrived late. Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee fortified the heights behind the town, Mary's Heights, a ridge bristling with cannon, backed by infantry in stone-walled positions. Burnside pressed forward anyway. On December 13th, under gray skies and freezing wind, wave after wave of Union soldiers charged uphill into a wall of fire. They never had a chance. The Confederate guns tore through the advancing blue lines with mechanical cruelty. Men fell by the thousands. Blood pooled in the icy fields. Union troops threw themselves against the wall again and again, only to be cut down with grim efficiency. One division, led by General George Meade, no one yet knew how important that name would become, managed to penetrate the Confederate right. But the breakthrough wasn't supported, and Meade was driven back. By nightfall, the Union had lost more than 12,000 men. Confederate losses were less than half that. The survivors huddled in the freezing dark, pinned down by Confederate sharpshooters, surrounded by the cries of the dying. For days, they could not retrieve their wounded. The fields turned white with frost, then red with blood. When the news reached Washington, the capital fell into gloom. Lincoln, already carrying the burden of a divided nation and the agony of lost sons not his own, sank further into despair. He had hoped that Burnside might bring order to the chaos. Instead, the general had brought ruin. "If there is a worse place than hell," Lincoln reportedly said, "I am in it." The northern press turned savage. Newspapers called Fredericksburg a butchery. Satirical cartoons mocked Burnside, mocked the administration, mocked the war. Congress grumbled. The people whispered. Morale plummeted. The Emancipation Proclamation, signed just weeks later, could not wash away the blood-soaked memory of that hill. Burnside offered to resign. Lincoln hesitated. He had already gone through McDowell, McClellan, Pope, and now Burnside. But the country demanded action. In January, Lincoln replaced Burnside with General Joseph Hooker, a man with a reputation as both a fighter and a political schemer. Fighting Joe, they called him. The name came from a misprinted newspaper dispatch and stuck. He was brash, confident, and, in the eyes of many, just what the Army needed. He reorganized the troops, improved rations, boosted sanitation, and restored discipline. Morale rose. Soldiers admired his energy, even if some questioned his character. Hooker was known for hard drinking and loud talk. His headquarters were rumored to be as much brothel as war room. But he had a plan, and after Fredericksburg, any plan seemed better than none. Spring came slowly in Virginia, dragging mud and rain behind it. The Army of the Potomac camped near Falmouth, across the Rappahannock from Fredericksburg, waiting for the roads to dry and the orders to move. Hooker had rebuilt the army. Now he would lead it into battle. His target, General Lee, still camped near Fredericksburg. Hooker believed he could outflank him. His plan was complex but promising. Send part of his army upriver, cross behind Lee's lines, and catch the Confederates in a trap. Hooker had more than 130,000 men. Lee had barely half that. The arithmetic was on the Union side. So was momentum. The men trusted Hooker. Lincoln was cautiously optimistic. Perhaps finally, this would be the victory the North so desperately needed. And for a brief moment, it looked like it might be. In late April, Hooker's forces began to move. The flanking maneuver succeeded. Lee was surprised. Union columns marched through thick forests and tangled underbrush, closing in on a place called Chancellorsville, little more than a crossroads surrounded by wilderness. Hooker reached it first. He took up a defensive position and waited, confident Lee would retreat. But Robert E. Lee did not retreat. Instead, Lee divided his army. Then he divided it again. It was a stunning, risky move, one that defied every military convention. With just 60,000 men, he split his forces in the face of a superior enemy. he left 10,000 to pin down part of Hooker's army near Fredericksburg, then sent General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson with 30,000 men on a daring flanking march through the woods. They moved silently, hidden by the dense wilderness. Union scouts missed them. Officers dismissed rumors. And then, on the evening of May 2nd, Jackson struck. His troops erupted from the forest like a thunderclap, crashing into the right flank of the Union army, which had been resting, unaware, thinking the day was over. Panic swept the blue lines. Regiments broke, wagons overturned, soldiers ran. Darkness fell, and with it came confusion and chaos. But victory had its price. As Jackson rode forward to scout the battlefield that night, Confederate pickets mistook him for a Union cavalryman. They fired. 3 bullets struck him, 2 in the left arm, 1 in the right hand. He was carried from the field. His arm was amputated. Lee, upon hearing the news, was devastated. "He has lost his left arm," Lee said, "but I have lost my right." Jackson lingered for several days. Pneumonia set in. On May 10th, he died. The South mourned. The North, even in defeat, felt a grim relief. The man they called the Hammer of the Confederacy was gone. But Chancellorsville was still a Union disaster. In the days that followed, Hooker's army reeled. He lost his nerve. Though he still had the numbers, still had fresh troops, still had options, he began to withdraw. Lee pressed the advantage. By May 6th, the Union army had retreated back across the river. Another campaign had ended in failure. Hooker had lost 17,000 men. Lee had lost 13,000, nearly a quarter of his entire force. But the South claimed victory. Washington fell into silence. Lincoln was crushed. Once again, the North had been beaten. Once again, it had all looked so promising, until it wasn't. Hooker, for all his swagger, had hesitated at the critical moment. He had lost faith in his plan. And Lincoln, already battered by political backlash to emancipation, now faced calls for a negotiated peace. The war seemed endless. 2 years of fighting, and still no clear path forward. The casualties mounted. The treasury bled. Newspapers printed lists of the dead that stretched longer every week. Families mourned sons and fathers who had marched off in 1861, promising to be home by Christmas and never returned. Cemeteries filled. Dreams dimmed. Despair began to seep into the Northern soul. The draft, introduced in March, added fuel to the fire. For the first time in American history, men could be conscripted to fight in a war they didn't believe in. The rich could pay $300 to avoid service. The poor could not. Resentment simmered. Lincoln faced enemies on all sides. Radical Republicans accused him of being too slow, too cautious, too moderate. Democrats called him a tyrant. Some whispered of election defeat, others of secession by the North. The president barely slept. His son Tad was often sick. His wife Mary was drifting deeper into grief and instability. Lincoln carried it all, alone mostly. He read poetry at night. He walked the halls of the White House in silence. He kept a Bible on his desk. And he waited. Waited for a victory. Waited for a general who would fight not just with strategy, but with fire. Waited for a sign that the Union was not doomed to bleed out in the mud of Virginia. It would come. But not yet. First would come more marching, more confusion, more blood. The war, having passed through its moral transformation, would now pass through its furnace. Because Robert E. Lee, emboldened by Chancellorsville, was preparing to move north again. Chapter 4. The Road to Gettysburg. The smoke of Chancellorsville had not yet cleared before Robert E. Lee was already planning his next move. Though the Confederate victory in May had come at a heavy price, especially with the loss of Stonewall Jackson. It had also opened a door, a bold, dangerous door, that Lee was determined to walk through. The time had come to carry the war north again. Virginia had borne the brunt of 2 years of conflict. Its farms were ruined, its fields trampled, its homes emptied. Lee knew that the land could no longer feed his army. He needed supplies, shoes, rifles, food, and he needed them from the north. But more than that, he needed a decisive victory on Union soil, one that would shake the North to its core, one that might force Lincoln to sue for peace, one that would perhaps, just perhaps, bring European powers to the table. He began the march in early June. The Army of Northern Virginia moved like a shadow through the Shenandoah Valley. It was a masterstroke of secrecy and speed. Lee split his army into 3 corps under Generals James Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and Richard Ewell. They crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, then into Pennsylvania, slipping through mountain passes and quiet towns, fanning out across the countryside. The North barely saw it coming. News of the invasion arrived like a thunderclap. Towns across southern Pennsylvania exploded into panic. Harrisburg braced for attack. Churches rang their bells, citizens formed militias, storefronts boarded their windows. In Philadelphia, rumors spread that Lee was headed for the city. In Washington, the government scrambled for answers. No one knew Lee's exact location or his objective. Some feared he would march on the capital. Others thought he would sweep through to Baltimore or even the rail hubs of Pittsburgh. Lincoln, shaken but clear-eyed, turned to the man who now led the Army of the Potomac. General Joseph Hooker, despite his boastful promises, had proven hesitant at Chancellorsville. Now he bristled at orders from Washington. He demanded autonomy, clashed with Lincoln's advisors, and even offered to resign when his demands were refused. Lincoln, with no time for tantrums, accepted. And so, just 3 days before the most important battle of the war, a new man took command. General George Gordon Meade was not flashy. He was not loud. He had never led an army before. But he was professional, measured, and, most importantly, willing. Lincoln gave him the reins on June 28th, with the Confederates already deep in Pennsylvania. It was a baptism by fire. Meade's first task was simple and overwhelming: find Lee. The Army of the Potomac turned north in pursuit. Tens of thousands of men marched across Maryland and into Pennsylvania, following country roads and whispering rumors. Lee had already reached Chambersburg, and his men had spread across the countryside like a tide, gathering supplies, gathering food, gathering intelligence. In the towns they passed, some greeted them with fear, others with sympathy. Pennsylvania was not a slave state, but it was not untouched by Southern loyalties. And Lee had issued strict orders: no looting, no destruction. This was to be a campaign of honor, he told his officers, not a campaign of vengeance. Still, the shadow of war darkened every village. Northern civilians had never seen the gray-clad men up close. Now they watched them from behind locked doors and shuttered windows, praying they would keep marching west. But the South's code of honor had its limits. Black citizens, freemen, runaways, even those born in the North, were dragged from their homes and marched south in chains. Confederate soldiers, seeing black families as escaped property, took matters into their own hands. Pennsylvania farmers watched helplessly as their neighbors disappeared into slavery. It was a silent terror that followed the Southern Army like a second ghost. By the end of June, Lee's forces were spread thin across southern Pennsylvania. He had expected the Union Army to stay near Washington, guarding the capital. But Meade moved faster than anyone predicted. And when Lee realized the Union Army was closer than expected, he began pulling his scattered corps together. He needed to concentrate his forces before Meade struck. Meanwhile, the Union Army fanned out, hunting for Lee's location. Cavalry scouts galloped across rolling hills, eyes on every farm road and dusty trail. On June 30th, Union cavalry under General John Buford reached a small town called Gettysburg. It was a quiet crossroads, surrounded by ridges, hills, and farmlands. Buford, sensing strategic ground, dug in. The next day, the Confederates arrived. Neither side had planned to fight there. It was, in a sense, an accidental battlefield. But the land, its hills, its high ground, its roads, would draw the armies toward it like magnets. On the morning of July 1st, Confederate General Henry Heth, advancing toward the town in search of supplies, specifically a rumored stockpile of shoes, encountered Buford's cavalry. The clash began small, but by midday it had escalated into a full engagement. Union reinforcements arrived from the south. Confederate divisions pushed from the west and north. The town of Gettysburg, once peaceful and unknown, became the eye of the storm. Meade, miles away, received word of the contact. He ordered his army forward. Lee, realizing the opportunity, ordered his scattered divisions to converge. The roads to Gettysburg filled with columns of infantry, caissons, and supply wagons. The hills began to echo with cannon fire. Battle had come, and neither side could now walk away. But in the days leading up to that fateful collision, there had been a tense and fragile uncertainty. Lee had hoped to fight a battle of his own choosing, in a place of his own design. But now the Union Army was too close. The element of surprise was gone, and Lee had no clear picture of Meade's strength or position. His cavalry commander, J.E.B. Stuart, had taken his riders on a wide, showy loop around the Union Army. But in doing so, he had left Lee blind. For days, Lee had no idea where the Union Army actually was. It was a costly mistake. Yet Lee was not deterred. He believed in his men, believed in their fighting spirit, their discipline, their fire. The victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville had hardened his confidence. They had beaten the Union Army before. They could do it again, this time on Northern soil. And Meade, though new to command, sensed the weight of the moment. He knew he could not afford another retreat, not on Pennsylvania land, not so close to Washington, not with the morale of the Union hanging by a thread. His orders were clear. Stand and fight. Hold the line. Break the myth of Confederate invincibility. Across the North, the public held its breath. Rumors flooded the newspapers. "Rebels at the gates!" Some headlines screamed. Refugees streamed from towns near the front. Farmers fled their fields. Railroads were clogged with families escaping westward. At night, lanterns flickered in church basements where women wept and prayed. But not all ran. Some stayed, some waited. Some watched the horizon and listened for the thunder of war. Lincoln received the reports in silence. He had hoped for peace, then prayed for victory. Now he simply waited. He understood that the coming battle would be more than military. It would be moral. It would test everything the Emancipation Proclamation had declared. Everything the war had become. Everything the Union had bled for. And it would be decided in the hills of a small Pennsylvania town, Gettysburg. It had no forts, no rivers, no major political significance, just a crossroads. A place where 10 roads met, where armies collided, where history, without asking, chose to be written. The road to Gettysburg was not paved with glory. It was paved with uncertainty, with exhaustion, with mud and hunger and questions that had no answers. And as the first shots rang out on the morning of July 1st, no one, neither Meade nor Lee, neither soldier nor civilian, could have guessed how the next 3 days would unfold. But they knew this much. Everything was about to change. Chapter 5. The Battle of Gettysburg, Day 1. The morning of July 1st, 1863, broke warm and clear over the quiet Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. It was a place of modest houses, dusty roads, and rolling farmland. Most of its 2,400 residents had gone to bed the night before, unaware that two armies were closing in on them from every direction. But by sunrise, war had arrived. Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford was already stationed west of town. Buford was a seasoned officer, sharp-eyed, practical, and brave. He had ridden into Gettysburg 2 days earlier, surveyed the surrounding hills and ridges, and realized the town sat on ground worth holding. To the north and west, the terrain sloped downward into open country. To the south and east, it rose into ridges and hills. Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top, high ground that could be decisive in a full-scale battle. Buford knew Lee's army was coming. He also knew that if Union forces didn't seize those heights first, the Confederates would. And so he waited. At around 7:30 a.m., the first Confederate troops under General Henry Heth approached from the west. Heth had been ordered to advance cautiously. He believed there were only militia in the town, perhaps just a few companies of untrained men. But what he encountered instead were Buford's dismounted cavalrymen, dug in along ridge lines just outside of town, armed with Spencer repeating carbines and ready for a fight. The skirmish began with a crack of rifle fire. By 8 a.m., it had swelled into a pitched engagement. Heth's brigades pressed forward, but Buford's men, though outnumbered, held their lines with grit and discipline. They fought to buy time for Union infantry to arrive and reinforce the position. Buford knew he could not stop the Confederate advance, but he could slow it. And then the blue columns began to appear. Shortly after 10 a.m., the vanguard of the Union Corps, led by Major General John Reynolds, marched into the fray. Reynolds was one of the Army's finest, decisive, experienced, and respected. Without hesitation, he ordered his men into line and rode to the front to oversee their deployment. As he turned to give an order, a Confederate bullet struck him in the head. He died instantly. His loss was a blow, but his reinforcements arrived just in time. Union infantry surged into position. Brigades from Pennsylvania, New York, and Wisconsin took up positions in the fields west of town. They joined Buford's cavalry and stiffened the Union defense. The fighting raged through mid-morning. Confederate brigades under Heth attacked again and again, but the Union line bent without breaking. By early afternoon, the tide began to turn. Confederate reinforcements under General Jubal Early arrived from the north. Simultaneously, additional Union forces under Major General Oliver O. Howard arrived and extended the line. Howard positioned the Union 11th Corps north of town, anchoring their line on a hill called Cemetery Hill just south of Gettysburg. It was good ground, but the troops he had brought were some of the least experienced in the Army, many of them German immigrants, derisively called Dutchmen by other soldiers. They would soon be tested. At around 2 p.m., the Confederates launched coordinated attacks from two directions. Heth struck again from the west, while Early's division swept in from the north and east. The Union 11th Corps was hit hard. Confused, outflanked, and under heavy fire, the lines began to collapse. Panic spread through the ranks. Men fled through the streets of Gettysburg in chaos, pursued by the advancing Confederates. Union forces west of town also began to buckle under pressure. General Abner Doubleday, now in temporary command after Reynolds' death, tried to hold the line, but the numbers were against him. Confederate brigades under General Dorsey Pender and General Robert Rhodes pressed relentlessly forward. The Union First Corps was flanked and began to retreat through Gettysburg itself, street by street, house by house. By late afternoon, the Union line had disintegrated. Soldiers scrambled through backyards, leapt over fences, and sprinted south through town to reach the safety of Cemetery Hill. Those who didn't make it were captured or killed. The streets of Gettysburg filled with the screams of the wounded, the crash of rifle fire, and the thunder of hooves. Civilians huddled in basements, praying the walls would hold. As evening approached, the Confederates controlled the town, but they had not seized the high ground. Union forces, bloodied but not broken, had retreated to the ridge south of town, Cemetery Hill. It was steep, defensible, and now reinforced. General Howard held the position. By nightfall, additional Union troops from General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps arrived. Hancock, sent personally by Meade to stabilize the front, rode along the ridge and surveyed the battered remnants of the day's battle. He saw panic in the eyes of the survivors, but he also saw resolve. He ordered the men to dig in. Cemetery Ridge would not fall without a fight. To the southeast, Union engineers began fortifying Culp's Hill. Further down the line, artillery was placed along Cemetery Ridge. Though the day had brought defeat, the Army had rallied on ground that could be held. Meade, still miles away, received Hancock's report and made a crucial decision. This was the place. The Army of the Potomac would make its stand at Gettysburg. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee considered his next move. He had not intended to fight a major battle that day. His plan had been to concentrate his forces before engaging the Union Army. But the battle had taken on a momentum of its own. Lee's officers, particularly General Ewell, now in command of Jackson's old corps, had driven the Union out of town and to the heights. Lee saw the opportunity. He sent a message to Ewell: "Take Cemetery Hill if practicable." Those two words, "if practicable," would become one of the most debated phrases in the war. Ewell, cautious and new to independent command, hesitated. His men were tired, scattered, and disorganized from the day's hard fight. He worried about counterattacks. Darkness was falling. He chose not to attack. The opportunity passed. If the Confederates had seized Cemetery Hill that evening, the outcome of Gettysburg might have been very different. But they didn't, and the Union dug in. Night fell over the ridges and fields. The moans of the wounded drifted on the warm breeze. Thousands of bodies littered the farmland. Inside Gettysburg, houses became hospitals. Churches filled with the injured. The Lutheran seminary, where Buford had first made his stand, was now a field hospital. Amputations began. Lanterns flickered late into the night. The first day had cost the Union nearly 9,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Confederate losses were similar, and yet the battle had barely begun. Meade, riding north through the night, ordered his full army to converge on Gettysburg. Over the next 24 hours, more than 90,000 Union soldiers would arrive. Lee's army, numbering around 75,000, was also on the move. The hills and fields around Gettysburg would soon be packed with men, cannon, horses, and death. But for now, on the night of July 1st, the town held its breath. The Confederates controlled the streets. The Union held the heights. The lines were drawn, and neither side would retreat. Chapter 6. The Battle of Gettysburg Day 2. Dawn broke over Gettysburg on July 2nd with a deceptive calm. Mist clung to the meadows, and the ridges lay quiet in the soft morning light. But the quiet was a lie. Beneath it stirred nearly 150,000 soldiers, men who had spent the night sharpening bayonets, whispering prayers, or lying awake in silence, knowing what the next day would bring. General George Meade had arrived late the night before and quickly assessed the situation. The Union Army now occupied a fishhook-shaped line stretching from Culp's Hill on the right, down along Cemetery Hill, and then south across Cemetery Ridge to two rocky hills. Big Round Top and Little Round Top on the far left. It was good ground, strong ground, but it was not yet fortified. And the Union left, especially the hills at the southern tip, remained dangerously exposed. Meade ordered reinforcements to take position. General Daniel Sickles, commanding the Union Third Corps, was assigned to the center left, anchoring the line on the lower portion of Cemetery Ridge. But Sickles, uneasy with the terrain and without waiting for approval, made a fateful decision. He moved his corps forward nearly a mile to occupy higher ground near a peach orchard and a wheat field. An exposed salient, disconnected from the rest of the line, vulnerable on both flanks. The mistake would cost dearly. As the Union reshuffled, Lee prepared to strike. He had spent the morning scouting the Union lines and developed a bold, familiar plan. Strike the Union left, roll up the line, and collapse Meade's position from south to north. General James Longstreet would lead the assault. His divisions, under John Bell Hood and Lafayette McLaws, would attack the Union flank, while General Richard Anderson would follow with a supporting attack on the center. Lee hoped to repeat the flanking success he had achieved at Chancellorsville. But the timing unraveled. Longstreet, reluctant and cautious, delayed his march. The roads were congested, the orders unclear. By the time Confederate troops were in position, it was already late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the fields. And then, the hills erupted. Hood's division surged toward the Union left, where Sickles's corps held its thin, overextended line. The Confederates crashed into the peach orchard first, the ripe summer fruit trampled beneath boots and blood. Artillery roared from both sides, the air filled with smoke, screams, and the high, sickening whine of Minié balls. Then came the wheat field. A sunken patch of golden stalks turned into one of the most vicious battlegrounds of the entire war. The fighting here was fragmented, furious, and personal. Regiments clashing at point-blank range, men firing through the smoke until their rifles were too hot to hold. The field changed hands multiple times. Blood soaked into the soil. Trees were splintered. Men fell by the hundreds. The wheat field became a graveyard before night even fell. To the south, Hood's Texans and Alabamians pressed toward the rocky hills beyond the wheat field, Devil's Den, and just beyond it, Little Round Top. And there, history hung by a thread. Little Round Top, the southern anchor of the Union line, was almost undefended. A few signalmen and skirmishers clung to the rocks, but no full regiments had been assigned to it. Meade's chief engineer, Governor Warren, climbed the hill to scout and was stunned to see Confederate columns forming in the woods below. He sent aides galloping through the smoke and chaos, shouting for reinforcements. The call reached Colonel Strong Vincent, whose brigade had just arrived. Without waiting for orders, Vincent led his men up the slopes of Little Round Top and positioned them along the rocky crest. At the far left of his line, perched on the hill's edge, stood the 20th Maine, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a former professor of rhetoric from Bowdoin College, now soldier by necessity. And then the Confederates came. Hood's men, tired from marching but burning with fury, charged uphill again and again. The rocks and trees became battlements. Bayonets flashed in the fading light. Smoke curled through the pines. Chamberlain's 20th Maine held fast, repelling charge after charge. Ammunition dwindled. Men collapsed from heat and wounds. And still the rebels came. Finally, with no bullets left and his line thinning by the minute, Chamberlain gave the order that would write his name into legend. Fix bayonets. The 20th Maine surged forward in a downhill sweep, catching the exhausted Confederates by surprise. It was not a massive charge, just a desperate, disciplined, terrifying push. But it worked. The Confederate line broke. The Union left held. Further up the line, however, Sickles's corps was collapsing. The peach orchard was lost. The wheat field was a slaughterhouse. The Union Third Corps was being torn apart. Sickles himself was wounded, his leg shattered by a cannonball. Carried from the field puffing a cigar, he tried to keep smiling, but his command was in ruins. General Winfield Scott Hancock rushed reinforcements to plug the gaps. The Irish Brigade, already decimated in previous battles, charged into the wheat field. The Pennsylvania reserves stormed down Little Round Top to aid Vincent's line. Union artillery on Cemetery Ridge opened fire to slow the Confederate advance. As darkness fell, the fields echoed with the last ragged volleys of musketry. Then silence. Bodies littered the peach orchard, the wheat field, and the slopes of Little Round Top. Wounded men groaned in the tall grass. Surgeons worked by lantern light. Amputation saws screeched against bone. Some men begged for water, others for death. It had been a brutal, chaotic, savage day, one of the worst in the war. The Confederates had gained ground. They had pushed the Union lines back along the center left. They now held the peach orchard and parts of the wheat field. But they had failed to break through. The Union still held the high ground. Meade's line had bent but not broken. And Meade, calm and calculating, was already preparing for what would come next. He called a council of war that night at his headquarters, a small farmhouse behind Cemetery Ridge. By candlelight, his generals gathered: Hancock, Slocum, Sykes, Sedgwick, Howard. They reviewed their positions, assessed their losses. Some urged retreat, others said hold. Meade listened, nodded, then spoke with quiet finality. "We shall stay," he said. Meanwhile, Lee was not finished. He had hoped Day 2 would bring decisive victory. It had not, but he believed that one more blow, this time at the Union Center, could split Meade's army in two. He turned to General James Longstreet and began to outline his next plan. Tomorrow, they would strike again. But tonight, both armies lay sprawled across the Pennsylvania countryside, surrounded by the dead, the dying, and the stench of gunpowder and blood. Somewhere in the dark, the stars shimmered silently over Gettysburg, indifferent to the carnage below. Day 2 had ended, but the storm was not over. Chapter 7. The Battle of Gettysburg Day 3. The sun rose on July 3rd over a battlefield choked with death. For 2 days, the hills and fields around Gettysburg had thundered with war. Smoke lingered in the morning air. The cries of the wounded drifted across the ridges. Somewhere, a lone bugle called the morning watch, though few had slept. On both sides, the soldiers knew the end was coming. One more day, one more push, and something would break. General Robert E. Lee had not slept much either. He paced through the night in his tent beneath a grove of trees west of town, reviewing reports, weighing the losses, and holding firm to a belief that had brought him this far, that his army could not be beaten. He had come to Gettysburg with purpose. 2 days of fighting had failed to drive the Union Army from its perch on Cemetery Ridge. But now, with his forces concentrated and the enemy battered, Lee believed the center of the Union line could be broken. He would try once more. The plan was simple and deadly. He would strike the middle of the Union position, that slight bend along Cemetery Ridge where Meade's line dipped. If he could punch through it, the Union Army would be split in two. Panic would follow. The road to Washington might open. Lee would send 3 divisions, one under General George Pickett, fresh and unbloodied, newly arrived with the Army of Northern Virginia, the others under Generals Isaac Trimble and J. Johnston Pettigrew. In total, more than 12,000 men would make the assault. They would advance across nearly a mile of open ground, rising and falling farmland, fences and ridges, and into the teeth of the Union artillery. General James Longstreet, who would command the operation, objected. He warned Lee of the futility, the danger, the cost. "It is my opinion," Longstreet said, "that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." But Lee would not be swayed. He believed his men would prevail. They always had. Across the field, General George Meade had not yet guessed Lee's exact plan, but he suspected another attack was coming. He reinforced the center, shifted brigades into the low stone walls along Cemetery Ridge, and ordered his artillery to prepare. The Union line, shaped like a long fishhook, now bristled with guns and riflemen. The calm before the storm would not last long. At around 1 p.m., the silence shattered. Confederate artillery, more than 130 guns, opened fire in a deafening roar that echoed for miles. Shells screamed across the sky and crashed into the Union positions on the ridge. Trees splintered, earth flew. Men dove for cover. It was the largest artillery barrage ever seen on the continent up to that point, meant to soften the center and silence the Union guns. But it failed. The Confederate aim was high. Many of the shells flew over the Union lines and exploded harmlessly in the rear. Meanwhile, the Union gunners, having learned to hold their fire, waited. They knew what was coming. Then, the cannon fire stopped. Out of the smoke and shimmering heat, the Confederate lines began to form. Men in gray and butternut rose from the woods along Seminary Ridge and dressed their ranks. Division after division, shoulder to shoulder, banners flapping, bayonets glinting. They moved forward in perfect lines, stepping out of the shadows and into history. This was Pickett's charge. Across the open fields, the Confederate infantry began their slow, steady march. Nearly a mile separated them from the Union line. The air was hot. The sun beat down. Union soldiers watched from behind stone walls, crouched in grass, and stared at the oncoming tide. Then they opened fire. First came the artillery. Union guns atop Cemetery Ridge thundered to life. Solid shot tore through the advancing columns. Shells burst overhead, raining iron. Men dropped by the dozens, holes torn in the lines, but the Confederates closed ranks and kept moving. Closer they came. Union sharpshooters opened fire. Regiments along the ridge braced for the impact. At the copse of trees, a small clump of oaks near the center of the line, the Confederates aimed. It was the focal point, the place where they believed the Union line could be cracked. As they crossed Emmitsburg Road, the slaughter intensified. Cannon fire from both flanks raked their lines with canister and grape shot. It was like walking into a furnace. Men were blown apart. Flags dropped and rose again. Officers shouted over the roar. Smoke and blood hung thick in the air. The momentum slowed, but did not stop. Then came the hand-to-hand fight. Some Confederates reached the stone wall. They climbed over. Bayonets clashed. Muskets fired at point-blank range. At the very center of the charge, a group under General Lewis Armistead briefly breached the Union line. Armistead raised his hat on his sword and led his men forward, shouting. They made it past the wall. For a heartbeat, it looked as if the impossible might happen. But then the Union counterattack struck. Brigades surged in from both sides. Reserves poured over the ridge. Union soldiers flanked the Confederate breach and enveloped it. Armistead fell, mortally wounded. The gray tide began to collapse. Those who could ran, many did not. Thousands surrendered. The ground they had crossed was littered with bodies, twisted wreckage, and torn flags. In less than an hour, Pickett's charge was broken. Lee rode out to meet the survivors. His face was calm, but his eyes were shadowed. He greeted the men with quiet dignity. "It is all my fault," he told one officer. "I asked more of my men than should have been asked of them." Pickett, shattered, would never forgive Lee. When asked to reform his division, he is said to have replied, "General Lee, I have no division now." On Cemetery Ridge, Union soldiers cheered and wept. They had held the line. They had repelled the best that Lee had to give. The center had not broken. The war was not over, but the tide had turned. More than 6,000 Confederates had fallen in the charge. The Union losses were heavy too, but nowhere near as catastrophic. In 3 days of fighting, over 50,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured, nearly a third of the two armies. Gettysburg had become the bloodiest battle in American history. As dusk fell on July 3rd, Meade walked the lines, quiet and composed. He had won the greatest battle of his life. Yet he remained cautious. He expected another attack. But it never came. That night, the Confederate camp was silent. Rain began to fall. The groans of the wounded echoed through the trees. Surgeons worked in makeshift hospitals. Dead horses lay bloated on the roads. Farmhouses overflowed with blood. Civilians crept from their cellars to a world unrecognizable. On July 4th, Independence Day, Lee began his retreat. He waited for Union attack that never came. Meade, wary of a trap and nursing his own exhausted army, did not pursue aggressively. Lee's battered forces slipped away through the mountains, harassed by Union cavalry but largely intact. The war would continue, but it would never be the same. Gettysburg had shattered the illusion of Confederate invincibility. Lee had gambled everything and lost. The North, long starved for victory, now had its triumph. Lincoln, upon hearing the news, was relieved but restrained. He waited. He hoped. He wondered why Meade had not chased them. And in the fields outside Gettysburg, the dead remained. Thousands of bodies lay unburied. The town was overwhelmed. Burial details worked for weeks. Graves were dug with trembling hands. In time, a cemetery would be established, a national cemetery. And in just a few months, Abraham Lincoln would return to this place to speak a few short words that would redefine the meaning of the war. But on July 3rd, the earth still trembled. The thunder of guns had faded, but the memory would not. The Battle of Gettysburg was over. The cost had been unimaginable, but the Union had held. The line had not broken, and for the first time in a long time, the North believed it might actually win. Chapter 8. Aftermath and Anguish. The guns fell silent on the night of July 3rd, but silence did not mean peace. It only meant death had finished its work. Across the fields of Gettysburg, the moans of the wounded replaced the roar of battle. Lanterns flickered across ridgelines and in barnyards, casting long shadows over broken bodies. Rain began to fall. Not enough to cleanse the earth, only enough to deepen the mud and wash blood into the soil. Morning brought no relief. The sun rose over a shattered world. Civilians who had hidden in cellars for 3 days stepped cautiously into the open. What they saw defied comprehension. Their quiet town, once known for its churches and college, had become a graveyard. Corpses lay in every field, every orchard, every yard. Horses lay bloated in the streets, legs stiff in the air. Trees were torn open by cannon fire. Fences splintered. The acrid smell of gunpowder clung to the air, mingling with the stench of death. People wept openly. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Farmers searched their properties in stunned silence. Men they had never known lay dead among their peach trees, their wheat fields, their gardens. Some still held rifles. Some had no faces left. The town of Gettysburg was overwhelmed. Every building that could hold a bed was turned into a hospital. Churches, schools, hotels, and private homes. The Lutheran seminary, once a quiet place of study, now echoed with the screams of men on operating tables. Kitchen tables became surgical stations. Barns became wards. Surgeons worked without sleep, without anesthesia, without hope of saving most. Arms and legs piled up in corners. Blood pooled on wooden floors. Tourniquets were twisted tighter and tighter until silence followed. Women from the town and surrounding countryside arrived with bandages, with bread, with tears. They sat beside unconscious soldiers, held hands, whispered prayers, wrote letters home for those who could not lift a pen. It no longer mattered which uniform a man wore. Blue or gray, they all bled red. Outside, the burial parties began their grim task. The sun beat down. The air grew thick. There were too many bodies and not enough shovels. In some places, the dead were buried in shallow trenches where they had fallen. In others, they were stacked like firewood, waiting for wagons. The names of many were never recorded. Rain would wash away their final footprints. Summer grass would cover the scars. The residents of Gettysburg did what they could. But it was never enough. Some began to go mad from the trauma. Children stopped speaking. Men dug graves until their hands bled. Women sobbed in their sleep. The town that had once known only sermons and school bells now lived in the shadow of suffering. And while the dead were counted, the living still moved. On July 4th, the anniversary of the nation's birth, Robert E. Lee began his retreat. The rain turned the roads to muck. His wagons, filled with thousands of wounded, stretched for miles. Union cavalry struck at the edges, but Lee moved with discipline. He crossed the Potomac under cover of storms and fog. His army was battered, but it was not destroyed. George Meade followed, slowly, too slowly. The victory at Gettysburg had cost him dearly. His men were exhausted, his officers wounded or dead, his army stretched thin. Meade knew Lee had been hurt, but he feared a trap. He feared risking the victory that had just been earned. And so he waited, measured, cautious. Abraham Lincoln was not. When word reached Washington that Lee had escaped across the Potomac, Lincoln's joy at the victory vanished. He slammed his fist on the desk. He paced the floor. He spoke bitterly to his cabinet. "What does this mean?" he asked. "We had them within our grasp." They were within our grasp. And nothing he wrote a letter to Meade that he never sent, a letter heavy with disappointment. "My dear General," it read, "I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape." He had hoped Gettysburg would end the war. He had hoped that the road to Richmond would open, that the South would lose its will, that the killing might stop. But the war raged on. Though the Union had won the field, the Confederacy still stood. Lee would regroup. His army would fight again, at Bristow Station, at Mine Run, in the Wilderness. The long road was not yet over. The blood would not yet stop flowing. Still, something had changed. Gettysburg marked a turning point, not just in strategy, but in spirit. For the North, it was proof that the Union could stand against the Confederacy's finest, that the myth of Southern invincibility could be broken. That victory, though distant, was possible. For the South, it was a bitter taste of vulnerability. Lee had marched north to strike a blow that might end the war. Instead, he was forced to retreat, wounded and diminished. His aura of invincibility, built at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, had cracked. His army was no longer untouchable. His cause no longer inevitable. And for the people, the farmers, the wives, the children, the soldiers, it meant only more death. More letters home in unfamiliar handwriting. More graves dug behind churches. More empty sleeves and empty chairs. No family escaped untouched. No town unscarred. And Gettysburg, this once sleepy town, would never be the same. The wounded remained for weeks, some for months. Families came to find their sons, dead or dying. Soldiers who had crawled to safety from the battlefield now lay in beds built from hay and broken boards, praying the fever would pass. Some survived. Many did not. Embalmers arrived to preserve the bodies of officers to be sent home. Coffin makers ran out of wood. The scent of rot hung in the air long after the dead were buried. And yet, life insisted on continuing. The birds returned to the trees. The wheat grew back in the fields. Children played again, though never quite the same. The scars beneath the grass remained. In the following months, plans were drawn for a cemetery, a national cemetery, one where Union dead would be reburied with honor, with names, with headstones. President Lincoln was invited to speak at the dedication. He accepted, though few expected much from him. He would only be the second speaker, following a long oration by Edward Everett, a celebrated former senator and scholar. But Lincoln's words would outlive them all. That moment had not yet come. In the aftermath of Gettysburg, Lincoln still sat alone in the White House, reading casualty lists by candlelight, wondering whether this victory had truly mattered. He understood the cost. He understood what it meant to send men into battle and then receive their names on paper, marked dead, missing, or broken. He understood that Gettysburg had saved the Union from collapse. But he also understood that it had not yet saved the soul of the nation. There were more battles to fight, more fields to die in, more speeches to give, more prayers to whisper. And outside the Capitol, the wounded still limped home, wrapped in bandages, haunted by the faces of friends who did not return. They would carry Gettysburg with them, always. Not just the sounds and sights, but the feeling. That moment when the line had held, when the charge had been repelled, when the hill had not been taken. That moment when something greater than strategy or politics had happened. when sacrifice gave meaning to survival. In time, Gettysburg would become more than a battle. It would become a symbol of struggle, of blood, of unity, of the terrible price of keeping a country whole. But in July of 1863, it was still just pain. It was the face of a mother reading a telegram. It was a farm boy trying to remember how to walk without a leg. It was a general pacing alone in a tent, writing a letter he would never send. It was aftermath. It was anguish. And it was not over yet. Chapter 9. Vicksburg Falls. While the hills of Pennsylvania shook with the roar of cannon and the fields of Gettysburg drank the blood of thousands, another storm had been building far to the west. One quieter, slower, but just as destructive. Along the twisting curve of the Mississippi River, in the heat-soaked city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant was closing a noose. The country watched the drama unfold at Gettysburg. But in truth, the fate of the Confederacy was being decided in two places at once. And on July 4th, the same day Lee began his retreat from Gettysburg, Vicksburg fell. The river had always been key. Control the Mississippi, and you split the Confederacy in two. East from west, Texas from Georgia, Arkansas from Virginia. It was the spine of the continent, the artery of trade, the highway of armies. Since the war's beginning, Abraham Lincoln had understood this. Vicksburg, he once said, is the key. And Ulysses S. Grant, grim, relentless, and patient, was the man to turn it. The campaign had begun months earlier, long before the thunder of Gettysburg. But Vicksburg was no easy prize. The city sat atop high bluffs overlooking a bend in the river, bristling with artillery, surrounded by swamps, bayous, and ravines. Its defenses were natural and man-made, dug deep and stubborn, and the Confederates who held it knew its value. They would not give it up easily. Grant tried everything. He sent engineers to dig canals to bypass the city, long ditches cut by hand in the heat, filled with snakes, mosquitoes, and disease. They failed. He launched probes and feints along the riverbanks. They were repulsed. For months, the campaign seemed cursed, and in Washington, nerves frayed. Critics whispered that Grant was stalled, stuck in the mud, perhaps even drunk. But Grant didn't listen. He rarely spoke. He studied maps, lit cigars, and kept moving. Then, in the spring of 1863, he made his move. Instead of assaulting Vicksburg directly, he marched his army south along the western bank of the Mississippi, crossed the river at Bruinsburg, further south than the Confederates expected, and began striking northeast toward the city from inland. It was daring. It meant cutting loose from his supply lines. It meant fighting in enemy territory with no retreat. But it worked. In a series of rapid battles, Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, Grant's army beat the Confederates again and again, forcing them back into the fortress city. By May, he had driven them behind their lines and sealed them in. The siege of Vicksburg had begun. For 47 days, the Union Army encircled the city like a python. Trenches crept closer every night. Artillery thundered every day. Shells rained down on homes, churches, marketplaces. The people of Vicksburg dug into the hillsides, carving caves into the clay where families huddled like animals, clutching their children, listening to the ground shake. Food ran out. Horses, mules, dogs, nothing was spared. Cornmeal mixed with peas became bread. Rats were eaten. Rainwater was collected from rooftops. Confederate soldiers on the line lived in mud and misery, sleepless, hungry, and hopeless. Their lines held, but just barely. The sun beat down. The flies swarmed. The Union lines crept closer. Inside the city, despair took root. But surrender was unthinkable. Confederate General John C. Pemberton, a Northern-born officer who had cast his lot with the South, knew what the loss of Vicksburg would mean. He also knew what starvation looked like. His men were gaunt. Civilians begged him to end the siege. The artillery never stopped. Union soldiers shouted taunts across the no-man's land. Still, Pemberton held out. Grant refused to let go. Unlike other generals who hesitated after victory, who wavered, who pondered, and withdrew, Grant pressed forward with machine-like resolve. When assaults failed, he dug in. When lines resisted, he surrounded them. He understood that time was on his side. The river was his. Supplies came freely. Reinforcements arrived. The Confederacy inside Vicksburg was alone. By late June, the city was collapsing. Men deserted. Ammunition dwindled. People emerged from their caves only to bury the dead. No relief army was coming. Communication had been cut. Pemberton's officers urged him to act. And so, on the morning of July 3rd, the same day Pickett's charge was breaking against the Union line in Gettysburg, Pemberton sent out a white flag. He requested terms. Grant, blunt as ever, offered none. He demanded unconditional surrender, as he had at Fort Donelson the year before. But Pemberton, unwilling to accept humiliation, argued for something more honorable. After brief negotiation, Grant relented slightly. Confederate soldiers would be paroled and allowed to go home, though most would return to fight again. Grant wanted the city, not prisoners. He wanted the Mississippi, and he got it. On July 4th, 1863, the Confederate flag came down over Vicksburg. Union troops marched in. Starved rebels stacked their weapons and staggered away. Civilians emerged, blinking into the sun. The siege was over. Fireworks exploded in Washington. Bells rang in northern towns. The news came days after Gettysburg, and for Lincoln, it was a 1-2 punch that changed the course of the war. "The Father of Waters," he said, "again goes unvexed to the sea." The Confederacy was now cut in half. Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, isolated. The Mississippi belonged to the Union. It was a blow that could not be undone. But Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July again for decades. To the people who had lived through the siege, who had buried their children and eaten their pets, who had crouched in caves as shells fell from the sky, the day was not one of independence. It was one of surrender, of hunger, of humiliation. A city laid bare. Grant, however, emerged transformed. Until then, he had been a general of the West, a commander known more for persistence than brilliance. After Vicksburg, he was seen as something more, a leader who would not break, a general who understood that war, to be won, must be endured. He did not seek glory. He did not court the press. He won battles, and he kept going. Lincoln noticed. In time, Grant would be called East. He would be given control of the entire Union Army. He would face Lee, not from behind a desk, but face to face, in trenches and fire and finality. He would become the one General Lincoln trusted without question. Because Grant, unlike so many others, finished what he started. Vicksburg proved it. And yet, like Gettysburg, the cost was high. The Union lost thousands in the campaign. The Confederacy lost more. But beyond the numbers was the symbolic wound. The South had lost its river. Its people had seen their cities bombarded, their soldiers surrendered. Hope faded. Reality crept in. The war, once romantic, once full of cause and trumpet, now rotted in trenches and burned in the eyes of starving children. Still, they would fight on. Even as Lee limped south from Gettysburg, even as Grant stood in the ruins of Vicksburg, even as the world looked and wondered if the end was near, the Confederacy did not surrender. Not yet. Not for nearly 2 more years. But from July 4th forward, the tide had turned. In the same breath, on the same day, in 2 towns 1,000 miles apart, the Union had struck. Lee's retreat, Pemberton's surrender, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, 2 names, 1 fate. And across the blood-stained map of America, a battered president in Washington allowed himself, for the first time in a long time, to believe in victory. Chapter 10. Lincoln in Crisis. The victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg had sent shockwaves through the nation, but the tremors they caused were not all joyful. For President Abraham Lincoln, July 1863 should have been a turning point, a moment to breathe, to believe, to step toward peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of another kind of battle, one not fought with rifles and cannons, but with ballots, headlines, and mobs. The war had entered its 3rd year, and the country was bleeding. 2 monumental victories could not erase the toll. The names of the dead kept arriving by the hundreds, then thousands. Newspapers printed casualty lists so long they spilled across pages like funerary scrolls. Families read them aloud in silence, their fingers trembling as they paused on familiar names. Lincoln read them too, every day. He kept them on his desk, beneath stacks of reports and telegrams. They were never far from sight. But even as he carried the grief of a nation, Lincoln faced another wound, one closer to home. His youngest son, Tad, had fallen ill again. At just 10 years old, the boy had already known more loss than many men. He still whispered about his brother Willie, who had died the year before. Now fever gripped his body. The doctors were vague, as they always were. Malaria, typhoid, some unnamed poison in the blood. Lincoln took no chances. He stayed at Tad's bedside late into the night, wiping sweat from his brow, holding his hand as the boy drifted in and out of consciousness. Mary, still haunted by Willie's death, could barely enter the room. The White House grew quiet. The president's eyes grew darker. Outside those walls, the world was erupting. The Emancipation Proclamation had changed the war, but it had also ignited fury. Not every Northerner supported the freeing of enslaved people. Not every Unionist was willing to die for abolition. The Copperheads, the anti-war Democrats, seized the moment. They called Lincoln a tyrant. They printed posters and pamphlets accusing him of dragging the country into ruin. They warned white workers that black men would soon steal their jobs. In taverns, street corners, and smoky back rooms, they spread fear like wildfire. Then came the draft. In March 1863, Congress had passed the Enrollment Act, allowing the federal government to draft men into military service. Every man between the ages of 20 and 45 was now eligible to be called. But there was a catch, one that would set cities aflame. Any man who could afford to pay $300 could buy his way out. The rich, it seemed, could stay home. The poor could not. The resentment simmered for months. Then, in July, the pot boiled over. On July 11th, just 1 week after the guns fell silent at Gettysburg, the first draft lottery was held in New York City. Names were drawn, printed in the papers. Mothers wept, fathers fumed. The anger that had been building finally exploded. On July 13th, mobs formed in Manhattan. What began as protests at draft offices quickly turned violent. Rocks smashed windows. Fire erupted. Police officers were beaten. Then, the rage turned racial. Black citizens became the targets. The mobs, convinced that the war was being fought for the benefit of freed slaves at their expense, turned on their neighbors. Homes were burned, churches torched. The Colored Orphan Asylum, a home to more than 200 children, was set ablaze. The children escaped. The building did not. For 4 days, the city descended into chaos. White workers, many of them Irish immigrants, roamed the streets in gangs, dragging black men from trolleys, from homes, from workplaces, and beating them to death in broad daylight. The police, overwhelmed, could not stop it. The army was still in Pennsylvania, still recovering from Gettysburg. There was no one left to defend the city but a handful of exhausted regiments. Lincoln watched from Washington in horror. He dispatched troops from the front. He sent General John Wool to restore order. He wrote urgent telegrams. But he could not stop the bloodshed from his office. New York was burning, and the fire was not just in the streets. It was in the soul of the Union. By the time the riots were crushed, more than 100 people were dead. Thousands were injured. Entire neighborhoods had been razed. And the nation had been reminded that the enemy did not live only in Richmond. He also lived in fear, in ignorance, in hatred, and in the hearts of men waving the same flag. Lincoln did not flinch, but he did suffer. He understood that the draft was necessary. The war required more men. Voluntary enlistment had dropped. The price of survival was manpower. But he also understood what the riots revealed, that many in the North still did not see black men as equal or even as human. That the Emancipation Proclamation, while noble in spirit, had yet to become reality in the hearts of too many. He carried this weight into every meeting, every letter, every sleepless night beside Tad's bed. And the political pressure only grew. In the fall of 1863, elections loomed in many northern states. Copperhead Democrats campaigned on a platform of peace. They promised to end the war, to reunite the country, to stop the bloodshed, without freeing a single slave. They called Lincoln a warmonger. They said he had betrayed the Constitution. Ikimu. In some states, they gained traction. Lincoln's own party, the Republicans, fractured between moderates and radicals. Some accused him of not doing enough for black Americans. Others said he had gone too far. He walked a tightrope over a canyon of anger, with no net below. And through it all, the war raged on. Casualties continued to rise. Letters from soldiers spoke of despair, of exhaustion, of dying for a cause no one could define anymore. Was it for union? For freedom? For politics? Lincoln struggled to answer those questions. But he never stopped trying. He worked late into the night, reading reports, drafting orders, writing letters to grieving mothers. His face grew gaunt. His posture slumped. His clothes hung loose. Cabinet members remarked that he looked older every week. Even his humor, once dry and constant, faded. But in private, his heart broke most for his son. Tad's fever came in waves. Some days he was lucid, laughing at stories, reaching for his father's hand. Other days he mumbled nonsense, his eyes glassy, his skin burning. Lincoln refused to leave him. He brought paperwork to the boy's room. He read him stories in a voice hoarse from speeches. He sat in the dark, listening to the rattle of his breathing. He had already buried 2 sons. He could not lose a third. In those nights, the war receded. There were no maps, no reports, no generals. Only a father and a child. Only the fear of grief. And then, finally, Tad began to recover. Slowly, the fever broke. His color returned. His voice grew stronger. Mary returned to his side. Lincoln allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to smile. It was not victory, not peace, not the end of the war. But it was something. It was life. And life, to Lincoln, was worth everything. By the end of 1863, the tide of the war had turned, but the storm had not passed. The victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg had proven the Union could win. But the riots in New York, the Copperhead speeches, the ballots cast in bitterness, these reminded Lincoln that the greatest battle might not be fought on the field, but in the soul of the nation. Still, he did not retreat. He would go on, through criticism, through sleepless nights, through personal grief and national chaos. Because to him, the Union was not just a collection of states. It was an idea, a promise, one that must not perish from the earth. Chapter 11. The Gettysburg Address. By November, the battlefield had quieted. The cries of the wounded had faded, the smell of death washed away by rain and time, and the hills of Gettysburg had turned from bloodied red to brittle gold. Autumn swept across Pennsylvania, gentle and unhurried, covering the scars of July in fallen leaves. But beneath the surface, the earth still remembered. The townspeople still walked with ghosts. The dead had not all gone home. Some had never left. After the battle, most of the Union dead had been buried hastily in shallow graves, many without names, many without coffins, marked only by crude wooden planks or not at all. Rain had exposed limbs and faces. Dogs had come. The townspeople were horrified. And so, within weeks, a decision had been made. A cemetery would be built. Not just a graveyard, but a national resting place. A monument to sacrifice. A consecration of the blood-soaked ground. A lawyer named David Wills, a local Gettysburg resident, took the lead. He secured the land, raised funds, and invited governors from every northern state. The date was set for November 19th. There would be prayers, music, dignitaries, and, at the center of it all, an oration by the famous Edward Everett, a scholar, diplomat, and former Secretary of State, known across the country for his eloquence and classical education. And then, as an afterthought, the President of the United States was invited to give a few appropriate remarks. Abraham Lincoln accepted. It had been 4.5 months since the battle. 4.5 months since Pickett's charge was shattered against the Union line. Since Meade had held the high ground. Since Lee had turned his army south in retreat. And yet the war still dragged on. Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and dozens of smaller battles had stained new corners of the map with blood. Lincoln's critics remained loud. The Copperheads were growing bolder, and though the tide had turned, it had not yet crested. But Lincoln understood that Gettysburg meant something larger than a tactical victory, something deeper than lines on a map. He understood that the soil there had been made sacred, not by words, not by monuments, but by what the men had done and by what they had given. And so, in the days leading up to the ceremony, as his train rumbled toward Pennsylvania, he sat in silence, scribbling phrases on scraps of paper, revising, striking out, rewriting. There would be no soaring flourishes, no theatrical gestures, only the truth, plain, clear, and terrible. He arrived in Gettysburg on the evening of November 18th, tired, solemn, and sick, with a mild fever. The train station was packed with citizens, farmers, soldiers, freedmen, widows. They cheered, but it was not a celebration. There was something reverent in the air, something heavy. The president stayed at David Wills's house, where he finalized his remarks in a second-floor bedroom lit by gaslight. Outside, the town held its breath. The next morning, the crowd gathered. They came by the thousands. Some walked for hours. Some came from out of state. Wounded veterans limped into the square on crutches. Mothers clutched photographs of sons who had not come home. Ministers prayed. Children climbed trees to glimpse the stage. The cemetery itself was still unfinished. Earth movers had carved terraces into the hillside. Graves were being dug even as the ceremony began. Rows of plain wooden markers dotted the ridge. Only a few marble headstones had been installed. The rest were promised. But the bodies were already there. Thousands of them, below the surface, sleeping beneath the town that had witnessed their final moments. At noon, Edward Everett stood and spoke. He was everything expected: learned, commanding, theatrical. His voice carried over the heads of the crowd for nearly 2 hours. He described the battle in vivid detail, invoked the ancients, quoted Latin and Greek. He praised the dead and urged the living onward. When he sat down, he received polite applause. Then Lincoln stood. He removed his stovepipe hat, stepped to the front of the platform, and looked out at the sea of faces. His eyes were sunken, his coat hung loose, and his voice was quiet. There were no dramatic gestures, no booming delivery. Only a man, tired, grieving, and resolute, speaking to a wounded nation. And then he began. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The words fell like stones into still water. Simple, clear, deliberate. Lincoln did not speak of vengeance or glory. He did not describe tactics or commanders. He spoke of a nation's birth, of its promise, and of the unfinished work left by those who had died to preserve it. We are met on a great battlefield of that war, he continued. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. But then he turned, away from the dead, toward the living. It is for us, the living, he said, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. In just 272 words, Lincoln reframed the entire war, not simply as a struggle to preserve the Union, but as a test of whether freedom and equality, those ideas born in 1776, could survive, whether democracy could endure fire, whether a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, could live. He ended with a promise, not of victory, but of resolve, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. When he finished, there was silence. Some say the crowd did not know the speech was over. Others say they were simply stunned. A few clapped, then more. But Lincoln stepped down quietly, folded the paper, and returned to his seat. The applause was polite, reserved. He turned to a companion and said, "That speech won't scour. It is a flat failure," but he was wrong. In the days that followed, the words were printed in newspapers across the country. Some editors dismissed them as too brief, too vague. But others saw what Lincoln had done. He had distilled the war to its essence. He had reminded the nation, not what it was fighting against, but what it was fighting for. The speech did not just consecrate a battlefield. It consecrated a purpose. And though Lincoln would not live to see the end of the war, or the full realization of the promises he had spoken that day, his words would outlive him. They would echo through classrooms, through marches, through memorials. They would be etched in stone and memory. And long after the guns fell silent, they would remain, carried forward by a nation that still struggled, still bled, still believed. Gettysburg had been a turning point on the map, but the Gettysburg Address was a turning point of the soul. And from that moment on, the war was no longer just about saving a union. It was about redeeming an idea. Chapter 12. The Bloodiest Year Ends. The final days of 1863 settled over the country like a blanket soaked in smoke and silence. Snow began to fall in some parts of the north, blanketing the hills in white, softening the earth that had been torn open by cannon and corpse. In the south, the ground was still muddy from the retreating boots of Lee's army, its fields empty, its towns aching. The year was dying, and with it, a part of the old America. The war had burned through 12 more months, through men, through money, through illusions, and left behind something changed. Not yet victory, not yet peace, but something irreversible. Over 100,000 men had been killed or wounded in the year now ending. Mothers had buried sons in every state. Fathers had received letters folded in trembling hands, written by strangers. Or worse, received nothing at all. Widows sat in empty parlors. Children lit candles beside photographs. Empty chairs outnumbered full ones at every Christmas table. The North, for all its victories, was weary. And yet, something had shifted. Gettysburg had not broken the South. Vicksburg had not ended the rebellion. But together, they had bent it. The Confederacy, once confident and defiant, now bled more than it could replenish. Its manpower dwindled. Its food stocks thinned. Its railroads cracked. Its hope, so long stitched into the stories of invincible generals and just causes, was beginning to fray. The Union, by contrast, had begun to move. It had not always been so. In the early years, it had fought defensively, reacting to Lee's movements, protecting Washington, waiting for the South to give up. But 1863 had changed the tempo. Grant's campaigns in the West proved that constant pressure could break an enemy. Meade's defense at Gettysburg showed that lines could be held, even against the fury of Lee. The Emancipation Proclamation had added moral weight. But it had also given the North something even more critical: momentum. That momentum, though fragile, would carry into the new year. Lincoln, sitting in the quiet chambers of the White House, knew this. He felt it, not as celebration, but as burden. He had buried the worst year of the war. But 1864 was coming, and with it, a new set of fears. The war was far from over. Lee remained in Virginia, entrenched behind formidable defenses, still commanding a fierce and loyal army. The Confederacy still controlled vast swaths of territory. Rebel cavalry still raided with impunity. Political dissent still boiled in the North. And the upcoming presidential election, less than a year away, loomed like a shadow Lincoln could not ignore. He was not certain he would win. Many in his own party had turned against him. Radical Republicans accused him of being too slow on emancipation, too timid in battle. War Democrats distrusted him for freeing the slaves. Peace Democrats, Copperheads, called for immediate negotiations with the South, even if it meant recognizing Confederate independence. Even within his cabinet, doubts remained. But Lincoln, weary and hollow-eyed, pressed on. He worked by candlelight, reading dispatches from Tennessee and Virginia, writing letters to grieving parents, pushing Congress toward a constitutional amendment that would end slavery forever. He met with generals, inspected wounded soldiers in hospitals, shook the hands of maimed veterans. His humor had grown rarer, his steps slower, but his will had hardened into something steel-like. Silent, inflexible, resolved. He had begun to think not just of winning the war. He had begun to think of rebuilding what came after. Reunification would not come easily. He understood that. The bitterness between North and South could not be patched with proclamations or parades. When the war ended, and he believed now, quietly, that it would end, it would leave scars not just on the land, but on the people, on their memories, on their votes. And he feared what vengeance might do. He did not want to punish the South. He wanted to bind it, to stitch the nation back together with mercy and with justice, not with gallows. But whether the people would follow him down that road remained to be seen. In the meantime, the fighting continued. In the West, General Grant tightened his grip on Tennessee. After Vicksburg, he had marched east, bringing with him the cold arithmetic of siege and assault. At Chattanooga, he broke Confederate lines that had held for months. He sent men up the steep slopes of Missionary Ridge, bayonets fixed, breath clouding in the mountain air. They charged not because they were ordered to, but because they believed the time had come to move forward. When they reached the summit, they did not stop. They kept going. It was Grant's way. Push forward, never let up, endure losses, endure doubt, end the war. Lincoln watched Grant's rise with interest. Unlike so many generals before him, Grant did not explain failure. He delivered results. He did not write dramatic letters. He did not flirt with the press. He fought, and he won. By the end of 1863, Lincoln had decided privately what he would soon decide publicly. Grant would lead the Union Army. All of it. Back in the East, the lines around Virginia had frozen into a grim routine. Lee dug in, fortified, waited. Meade watched, mirrored, waited. Skirmishes flared and faded. Cavalry darted through forests. But no major assault came. Both sides braced for spring. Behind them, politics brewed. In New York and Ohio, in Illinois and Pennsylvania, anti-war protests gained steam. Newspapers printed sensationalized casualty numbers. Rumors of peace negotiations with Europe, false and true, spread confusion. A growing number of Northerners asked, why continue? Why not let the South go? Lincoln had no simple answer, because it was not about just the land, not just the Constitution, not just the economy. It was about the soul of the Republic. If the South could break away simply because it lost an election, then the great experiment of American democracy would collapse under its own weight. If the Union meant nothing more than convenience, then the whole project, the Constitution, the Declaration, the Revolution itself, had been for nothing. And if slavery endured, even in part, then freedom itself was a lie. That was the battlefield Lincoln now saw stretching before him. Not a ridge or a river, but a battlefield of ideas, of national memory, of moral reckoning. He had walked through enough hospitals to know what it cost to turn those ideas into action. And as the year ended, he walked again. On Christmas Eve, Lincoln visited a Washington hospital. It was a quiet visit. No press, no announcements. He moved from bed to bed, speaking softly to wounded men. Some had lost arms, some had lost legs, some had lost the ability to speak. They looked at him with wide eyes, unable to believe the president had come to see them. He held their hands. He listened. He offered what little comfort he could. He returned to the White House that night alone. Mary had tried to prepare a holiday gathering. Tad, fully recovered now, had begged for a Christmas tree. Lincoln smiled for his son. But when he stepped into his office later, he did not smile. He stared out the window, into the snowy darkness, and whispered to himself. He knew what was coming. In the distance, the clock struck midnight, and with it, the bloodiest year of the war came to a close. A year of fire and turning tides. A year of hills and rivers, of cemeteries and riots. A year of speeches and sickness and sacrifice. The war was not over. But it had changed. The South was bleeding. The North was marching. And somewhere, far beyond the map, the idea of America stood trembling, but still standing.